Welcome to Claim Your Confidence, a podcast that will introduce you to the most powerful people in the world. No matter what obstacles you face, Claim Your Confidence will inspire and motivate you to go after the life you want. Are you ready to claim your confidence?
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Claim Your Confidence. I'm Lydia Fenet, and I could not be more excited to be back in the studio. I've had a small break for the new year, and it feels great to be back here, and I'm so excited about my interview today. You know, we live in a world where it seems like there is a mass shooting, a school shooting, or an act of violence with a gun almost every day. In fact, there are on average 327 shootings a day in America. And as a mom of 3 school-age children, I can tell you that it keeps me up at night. And I know many of you out there feel exactly the same way. In many ways, I think we can feel hopeless. But this interview for me today makes me think that there is hope. And that comes in the form of vision. And the woman who is with me today is president of Brady United. Kris Brown is a tireless advocate working to unify all Americans against gun violence. So no matter your political affiliation, your age, your ethnicity, or race, Kris's belief is that we're fed up and fired up to stop what is killing Americans senselessly every hour of the day. Kris, welcome to Claim Your Confidence.
Lydia, thank you so much for having me. I'm a big fan, and it's a pleasure to start out the new year with this conversation. I'm looking forward to it.
I am too. So, Kris, we're going to delve into your confidence journey because you must have confidence of steel to do your job. That is the truth. And I want to know, where did this all begin for you? Where are you from? Where did you grow up?
I grew up not far from where I'm sitting today, although I've lived in other places. I'm in Arlington, Virginia, as I speak to you, and I grew up about 20 miles from here in Springfield, Virginia. My father was a federal employee. My mother worked on campaigns. So that tells you a little bit of my origin story. She ran for office and was always involved in some kind of political campaign of some kind or other, or grassroots movement. And so I was raised by 2 people who really sort of blazed a path for trying to make the best version of the world that we could, and a view that that was really an obligation that each of us has, and a joy to carry out in trying to make the world live up to its ideals.
That's incredible. It must be amazing as a child to watch your parents really trying to change the world. It must give you a huge view of what the world can be.
It does. I think it also gives you something that's really important that I think a lot about as a mom to 2. I have a 22-year-old and a 20-year-old. And it gave me a sense of community. It's incredible. There's nothing else like being in activity around a cause that's bigger than you, with a lot of other like-minded people who really care a lot about the kind of world we live in and making a difference. And there's no dollar sign that ultimately gives you the satisfaction of that kind of work. It's the purpose, the calling, and the sense of community that is so hugely enriching that you always kind of strive after when you've had that kind of experience.
I can imagine you as a young child with like a sign in a picket line of some sort. That to me is what you do when you're a child of an activist or somebody who's in it in such a big way. That must have been exciting. Were you confident? What were you like as a child?
I don't think I was particularly confident. I was someone who had a sense of conviction about the world. I had a very strong sense of right and wrong for whatever reason. I'm not exactly sure where that came from. It was just always sort of ingrained in me, a sense of fairness and equity about the world that was very, very important to me. But I don't think I was particularly confident. I was not confident either, in the sense that I would just go after the things that I wanted without thinking a whole lot about all of the barriers, which were substantial.
Yeah, it's probably the best, right? Ignorance is bliss.
Right. You know, I went for all regional choir when my cousins today say, please stop singing. You know, there are things that I would do and try and would have to be persuaded that I was not particularly good at them. And the world did persuade me of some of those things. But I didn't let a lot of, I guess, notions that I couldn't do something stand in the way. I did have, I guess, a fair amount of innate confidence that I could figure something out if I needed to, and that there were things that I could do or say that would add value. I mean, that's sort of a basic, I guess, belief that I had
Yeah.
from the time I was very little.
I wonder how much of that had to do with watching parents who had a voice, and were really out there using it, as opposed to people who were just sort of watching things and letting the information come to them versus being the people who were putting it out there. It's such an interesting way to grow up, and really must have been very cool, especially in the place that you were living. I mean, I don't know where you grew up, how far that is from DC, but I imagine everything around that feels very robust and political in many ways.
It does. It feels like you're sort of you are, right? It was really a suburb of DC. And so a lot of people that I grew up with, their parents also were federal employees or activists or members of the military. I had many friends in my community. And so service was underlying many households and neighbors that I grew up with. It's sort of embedded as part of that. And DC was right there, just a 15-minute drive away. So probably that also infused part of how we kind of thought about the world.
Yeah, just sort of bigger than where you were by itself,
Right.
which I think is obviously a way that most of us grow up. It's sort of like, especially when you're little, you're just really thinking about the things that are around you, not the bigger world. So a very unique upbringing. So where did you leave when you eventually left Virginia? What was the first time that you left to go somewhere else?
Well, I went to college at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg, which was the same state. Virginia is actually quite a large state, about 5 hours from Springfield and a world away. And so that was a material change. And anyone who's traveled across the country in the US knows that sometimes even within a state, sometimes you can have 4 or 5 different distinct kind of regions, even within a state. Texas comes to mind, for example. So that was a big change. And then after that, I ended up moving to Switzerland. I worked on Capitol Hill for a long time in DC, but then I went to law school and was a lawyer in private practice, and then became general counsel of a company that was based in Switzerland. So that was a big move and a big change for everyone in the family, a welcome one, a really great one, but gave me a lot of perspective about the world and how I wanted to try to be engaged and involved if I did come back to the United States, and ultimately led me to Brady. So fast forwarding a little, those are some of the points in my journey along the way.
It must have been interesting coming from a family that's political, living so close to DC, to make a decision like that, to do something completely different. I wonder what led you down that path. Were you not immediately drawn back into what you'd seen growing up? What brought you to law school?
My father took the LSAT, I think twice, and had always planned to go to law school. He ended up getting sick and couldn't. And that was always a hard thing for me, and I know for him. But I'm an only child, but my dad was the oldest of 6. My mom is the oldest of 3. Irish Catholic, debate all of the time. I think on my dad's side, I have 15 first cousins, and I think 12 of us are attorneys.
Wow, that's
so
amazing.
It's but either a blessing or a curse. It depends on who you talk to. But that was always kind of part of the journey. And feeling that your voice, writing, advocacy, persuasion are very important core sort of values and core skills to have. I thought, well, if those are important to me, what kind of profession can I put them into reasonable use in? And attorney
law school it was. My dad's an attorney, and I feel like everything you've just said is so true. I can't tell you how many times, even as recently as the Christmas holidays, when I'm at home with my dad, I'll end up in a political conversation, and I can't tell which side of the fence he's on. And he does it. He's done this ever since I was little. It's like he's arguing a side, and I'm like, wait, do you think that? And he's like, I don't know, maybe. You know, he never wants to let you know what he believes in a way just because he loves the argument side of it. So I definitely thought about going to law school.
Exactly.
I'm kind of jealous that you followed that path, although I know we all find our ways differently, but I always thought, because my father was a lawyer, that was going to be the path. So to Switzerland you go, and that was a wonderful experience. Was there anything there that you felt really challenged you or challenged what you thought about the world at that point? Or did you feel like you were kind of in line with where you should be?
I think it challenged a lot about the world. I mean, my kids were younger, and so they went to international school. I mean, my daughters came home. I love the intro. Congratulations to Lydia's mom for the incredible intro to the show.
My mom hates public speaking, so she gets a huge high five from me anytime I think about her recording this in the booth.
I love it. Everything sounds better with a British accent. But my daughters came home with a British accent because they were taught in a British international school, which was wonderful. They lost it, sadly. But I think for me, it was the ability to see the United States, where I grew up, from the perspective of an outsider, which is how the news is reported. It's reported differently. The way you even see maps of the world, the U.S. isn't the center of the world.
It is curious when you're not here, isn't it?
It is very curious. I have a friend who just landed in Australia and took a picture of the map and said, "Look where the U.S. is, right? Not in the
Other
center
side of the world."
And it really helps you understand the things that sometimes you take for granted or you assume are based on your own cultural mores and beliefs. So when you're outside of that culture for any extended period of time, you start realizing that ways of thinking and ways of being have been shaped by your culture, and you start questioning those things. So it opens your mind. You know, Mark Twain said, travel is fatal to prejudice. And certainly it is, to me, one of the most important ways that you can get outside of certain perspectives that you have in your mind and really understand, what do I think about this? And how have my beliefs been shaped by the culture I am? And do I agree with those beliefs or do I disagree with them? Right? A little bit how you said your father will argue something and you'll say, well, do you believe that? And we'll say, well, I don't know. Right?
Yeah.
And it's a very interesting thing to be able to question that about yourself and about the world and really cement or solidify in your own mind what you do really care about and what you think about. And living there in Switzerland, a very different culture. It has 8 million people.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very, very different culture, very different country. Allowed me to see a lot about the US that I love, that I hadn't really focused on, quite frankly, and a lot that I wanted to fix. And this issue of gun violence was absolutely one of them because everyone there asked me about it. And what they asked is, well, where can I go where I won't be shot?
Wow.
And they were very earnest about it. Didn't matter where they were from. I got asked that question once a week. And it broke my heart and it made me very angry.
Yeah.
Realizing that's how the rest of the world thinks of it. And they're not wrong.
Yeah.
So I wanted to do something about that.
So what brought you back from Switzerland?
So I'd been in the private sector for 16 years between being the general counsel of this company. And prior to that, I was practicing at a larger firm. And I had started up my career in the prior 8 years on Capitol Hill, so working in the public interest. And I decided at that point in my career, I either stay in Switzerland outside of the US and probably live the rest of my professional life there, raising my girls there, or we make a change and move back and I get more involved, sort of cycling back around into cause-oriented work. And at that point in my career, I felt a calling to make that change and put more time and effort into trying to fix some of these things I was asked about as an American. I do think that has a lot to do with being raised by the parents I was raised by, feeling very connected to this country and believing that I had, in a sense, an obligation. That might be too strong a word, but a real calling to come back and try and do something about some of these things that, to me, are a blight on the America that I believe we all deserve.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when I was reading through all your bio and everything that has been written about you and watching interviews with you, one thing that struck me time and time again is you have such an amazing way of speaking to both parties. Because in the America that we live in today, there's all this talk about divisiveness. You know, we hear about these two parties when in fact, I'm sure you know this, and I, having grown up in Louisiana, having lived in New York for the equal amount of times in my life, know that most of us are really in the middle. Like we don't really believe what we're seeing, you know, in the news outlets and in the papers that we're reading and the engagement that we're getting on social media. And so it's amazing to me that you saw this from a different country and wanted to come back to America and make it the America that we all want this country to be. So what did you do? Where did you go to make that happen? What was the first step for you?
Really, when I look back on my career, I'd like to say, especially I like to say this to my daughters, this was the product of careful planning and detailed
Said
analysis.
No one ever, right, in a career. Yeah.
And really, it's a series of happy accidents. If there's a common theme in it, it is connecting with someone and having a great conversation and having a probing sort of discussion about, well, what's next, and having that person remember me or reference me in an opportunity that might be coming out. That's how I got my first job on a congressional campaign. That's how I got my first job in Congress. That's how I ended up going to law school, all of these things. So every step along the way is similar. The last part about coming to Brady probably is a little bit more intentional because I left a job that I really loved to come back to the United States and took a year off. I hadn't done that. My daughters were in middle school and I really wanted to spend a little time at home. And I reached out to my network, including the member of Congress who I had previously worked for, to say, hey, I'd like to get involved in gun violence prevention. The other issue that I'm very passionate about, but I know a little less about as a subject matter expert, is climate change. If you hear of anything, please let me know. And then, as fate would have it, within 3 or 4 months, my former boss, the member of Congress, contacted me and said, well, Brady's looking for help in putting together a strategic plan. By then I was consulting. I had a number of clients. So I added Brady as a client, and then the role just grew and grew and grew. And then the board asked me to become president. So that's sort of how it happened. It feels sort of like another happy accident, I guess, but there was a lot more networking and planning and really trying to figure out, okay, how do I get into that space again? Because I know it's one that I think it would combine a lot of skills that I have, but I know I'd be hugely passionate about it. And that was very, very important to me.
And for those people who are listening who don't know that much about Brady, will you tell us how Brady became what it is today? Because I think that's a really important part of this story that I want to make sure everybody knows.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Brady, of course, is named for Jim and Sarah Brady. Jim Brady served as President Ronald Reagan's press secretary. For many of your listeners, they may remember where they were when President Ronald Reagan was shot, and Jim Brady, his press secretary, was with him. He and several others were shot. Jim Brady was treated at GW Hospital, just as Ronald Reagan was, President Reagan, who was discharged shortly after, but Jim Brady was shot in the head and had severe health consequences as a result of that. When he and Sarah afterwards were really reflecting on what can we do about this, they focused on how the shooter obtained the firearm and really looked at some of the gaps in the law and wanted to do something about it. So they joined a small organization that was in D.C. They lived in Alexandria, Virginia, right next to Washington, D.C. That organization was Handgun Control, Inc., and they started working and lobbying to create a national instant background check system, in part because a system like that would have been very helpful to potentially prevent the purchase of the firearm that happened with Jim Brady's shooter. And so it took 6 years and 7 votes. It's amazing to think about it. But Handgun Control Inc., because of all of that work that Jim and Sarah put in, just tirelessly renamed the organization after them in the 1990s, and it continues to carry their name today.
Yeah. And you just said what struck me when I was reading about this last night: 6 years, 7 votes, and I believe 3 presidents, right?
Yes.
I'd read that, to impact change from someone who was so visibly shot in front of someone for our president, when someone was trying to assassinate our president, seems almost like a no-brainer, right? What does it feel like to get involved when you know that this is the journey for every piece of this conversation with gun violence? What does that feel like for you from a confidence standpoint as you enter into this journey, knowing that you have to be in this for the long haul? This is not change that happens overnight. People's minds are not changed overnight. So how do you steel yourself against that? What do you do to push yourself out there and continue to do it, even though a lot of times it does take years to impact change?
Every good thing that has happened that I care about is not an overnight success. People talk about overnight successes in our country like that's a real thing.
Right.
This star was an overnight success. And then you meet the person, they're like, I waited tables for a decade and did,
I was in check for 50 years, but yes, overnight success.
So it's really a myth that is the case. That's one thing. I'm also a big believer in the idea that if you have right and the best interests and something that everyone actually believes in, which is people should not be in a country where they can be randomly shot and targeted, that every bit of our effort is worth that kind of outcome, even if the path is not linear, even if there are certain setbacks, even if you're working against, unfortunately, organizations that are heavily funded and will really stop at nothing to achieve their goals, because the alternative is unthinkable, right? It is simply unacceptable to have an America where in some communities it's easier to get a firearm unlawfully than it is to get a library card or a fresh salad, where gun violence is the #1 killer of our kids, and not do something to stop it. And there's so many more people who agree with this, who desperately want this to happen. And from my perspective, I guess it's also related to the idea that by solving this issue, which is a public health crisis in America, we solve a lot of other issues too. If you're living in a community where gun violence is that pervasive in an everyday reality, there's so many things stacked against you. And to me, that is not allowing people to pursue and reach the American dream. It's a deeply unequal America, and I want to serve my own upbringing and interest by saying that's not okay, that's not acceptable. And even if I have to fight every day for the next many years around that and make marginal gains, it still probably means that's a life. That's someone who's saved. And that to me is worth everything.
So the tenor of American politics has certainly shifted a lot, especially in the last decade. How do you feel that we can all get to a place on either side of the aisle where we agree on something? Is it that you put forth a particular bill, or is it that something that you think that is so easy for people to understand that we all get behind? I mean, what is the solve here? Like, what is the solution to doing what you want to do, which is eradicate gun violence entirely, obviously, but by 2025, have it go down by 25%? What do you say in a community? Like, what are we supposed to be doing right now?
Well, I think the first is obviously recognizing that gun violence as a public health epidemic is a really important component to that. And the reason why that's important in terms of answering your question is there is no one policy solution. Policy improvement, it is very important. So where we're focused is, let's expand the Brady law. Let's make sure that every gun sale that happens with a background check. And I can get into why that's not happening as effectively right now, but that's a very easy legislative fix. That's the first thing. Better permitting is important too. Also, though, enforcement of the law, right, which is really quite straightforward. There's no political disagreement about that. A law has passed, and now the question is, how can you ensure that the law is evenly and fairly administered and that it actually works? So we're putting a ton of time into that right now. We have a new director of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, Steve Dettelbach, who has been appointed by Joe Biden, confirmed by the United States Senate. Where he is focused right now, and Brady is helping with this, is making sure that the dealers of firearms across this country actually are not engaging in unlawful practices, right? Just violating the law, but they haven't had enough enforcement authority to do that well. Prior to Director Dettelbach getting involved, the average gun dealer was inspected once every 7 years.
Wow.
And then the chance of that gun dealer, even when huge infractions were found, of getting shut down was almost zero. That's a real problem because we have more gun dealers in this country than McDonald's and Starbucks combined.
Oh my
and
gosh.
We know about 5% of them are responsible for 90% of crime guns. So how can we as private citizens, if we're not going to lobby our state legislators or our federal lawmakers, which the average person can't always easily do,
Right.
How can you get more involved and engaged? Talk to your local police and say, are you helping to inspect these dealers that are in my neighborhood? You can go to Brady's website, and we have a project called gunstoretransparency.org. You can look up your zip code and see which gun dealers near you are subject to infractions, and talk to your local police about inspecting those. So lifting up and using your voice. And the last aspect of it is policy and enforcement are key, but cultural norm change is also hugely, hugely important. And that really gets to Brady's legacy, that Jim and Sarah were gun owners. When Jim was shot, they stayed gun owners all the rest of their lives. We have a huge number of people at Brady who are committed to freeing America from gun violence, who are gun owners. This does not have to be a polarizing issue. The number one way that we can save lives from preventable gun violence is if you or a neighbor or friend, family member have a firearm in the home, safely store it. End family fire in your home. And that means unloaded firearm, locked in a safe, ammo separate. If every single American ended family fire in their home tomorrow, it would do more than any possible combination of policy and enforcement actions to save lives. We would cut gun deaths in half overnight.
So say that to me one more time.
I'm deeply passionate about that.
What are the 3 keys?
The 3 keys are better policy, better enforcement of the law, making sure that the agencies like ATF and your local police who are inspecting the dealers who are selling guns ensure that every single purchase is done lawfully. Very, very important, because a huge number of guns that are used in homicides are actually originating in sales that are not happening in a fully lawful way, right? Hugely important. Brady's very focused on that. The third is cultural norm change. We have to remind gun owners across this country and people thinking about buying firearms of something very important. Safely storing a firearm in the home is the difference between protecting your family and putting your family at risk, or other people entering your home. And what does that mean? That means ensuring that the firearm is unloaded and locked and ammo separate. Brady has an entire campaign, our End Family Fire campaign. You can find out all of the different ways to think about safe storage. But the key thing is, if every American could do that today, it would cut gun deaths in half tomorrow.
That is unbelievable. That statistic is really unbelievable. So take your gun, take the ammo out, store it separately, and lock it up. It seems so easy, but I think we've all read those stories about the child who wanders into a closet or the burglar who comes in and grabs the gun. I mean, it's incredible that we're still at a place where that something so simple could be taking away half the people who are dying from gun violence over the course of a year.
It's really tragic because it is so preventable. We have 8 kids a day who are killed or injured with guns, typically in their very own home or in the home of a loved one, exactly this way. So we could end that. We could cut suicide dramatically. The number one risk factor of suicide by firearm is presence of a loaded and unsecured firearm in that home. And let's keep in mind, 65% of our gun deaths are suicide.
Yeah.
Right. So that is material. And also 75% of school shooters get their gun from a home where that firearm is not safely stored, from Columbine on forward. So all of these different harms could be drastically reduced if all of us engaged in safe storage of firearms in our homes.
Kris, I have to say, I think you must have the hardest job in the world. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, there's so many things that you're covering under the umbrella of gun violence that you have to be the person who stands up to. What does it take for you to be on camera time after time as these school shootings are happening, as these mass shootings are happening, or as these shootings are happening in people's homes, understanding that all it takes is something that's simple? Do you sometimes feel like you're just banging your head against a wall in many ways? Or do you feel like what you're doing is going to fundamentally change the way that people see this? And as a community of people who are listening to this, as the people over time who will listen to this podcast, what can we do in our own communities today? Obviously, we start with the family fire that you're talking about, but how can we help raise this narrative in a way that's positive and moves things forward without coming into this political fire that seems to take place every time the topic of gun violence comes up?
Such a great question. I guess to answer it, yeah, I mean, there are some days that I do feel hopeless and sad and depressed. One of the hardest parts of this job is the number of survivors who I count as extremely close personal friends, and that group grows. It's not diminishing. And any of us who've met parents or daughters or nieces or nephews of individuals who've been lost to gun violence understand the impact on their lives is absolutely devastating, and it's permanent. Yeah. It never goes away. It never changes, and its ripple effect, not just on them directly, but their extended families, their communities, is devastating. That is a very hard reality for any of us to live with, but I guess part of what gets me up every day is I don't think it should be simply incumbent on those who've suffered the worst possible tragedy to get up and lead movements to fix it. This is on all of us as Americans to fix and to address. And to me, one of the best and easiest ways to do that, if you have 2 minutes or 5 minutes or an hour or more, is to think about End Family Fire, that campaign, right? Mm-hmm. And what that is really each of us talking to each other. Brady long ago started a campaign called Ask. Asking Saves Kids. And it has a very fundamental premise, which is, as a parent, if you are sending your kid on a play date, before they go, ask about whether there's a firearm in the home. That's such a big deal because it's accomplishing a couple of different things. One, it's informing you. And my daughter, Sophia, had horrible allergies when she was little. So I asked every question under the sun and felt fine doing that, right? All of those things. Okay, are you sure? Have you checked the contents of your refrigerator? I mean, it was probably intrusive. How can we not also ask this question? And what you find when you ask, which is so amazing, is that people are grateful you're asking.
Probably reminds them to look, honestly.
Correct. Yeah. Correct. And we have over 400 million firearms in this country. We have more guns than people. So one of the things that really makes me feel good about this is we have this sense sometimes that this is an issue that pits gun owners against non-gun owners. Nothing could be further from the truth. Yeah. This is something where 94% of Americans, gun owners, non-gun owners, believe, for example, in the policy solution to this. Gun owners, by and large, they like getting asked the question about this because then they can say, oh, yes, and I safely store my firearms. But you know what happens a lot of times is you'll ask the question and someone will say,
I don't know.
I need to check on that.
Yeah.
You're right. I think we inherited something from my husband's dad. And they'll check and then they will safely store the firearm. We get letters from people about this. We get testimonials. And that is such an incredible inspiration to all of us at Brady, all of us in the movement, because we know that that is potentially saving a life, stopping an injury from people who are entering that home, who are friends and loved ones, etc. The last thing that those folks want is for someone to come in and get injured. And we can all be agents of change to make a difference in other people's lives around that. So that's a really, really simple way. I think all of us can get involved and engaged in the issue. And of course, Brady has chapters everywhere as well. So with people with more time, join a chapter and get involved. At our website, bradyunited.org, you can find out all kinds of information about how you can get as greatly involved or as little involved as you want.
It's amazing. Everything that you're saying to combat gun violence is really about conversation, right? It's about having these conversations and these open dialogues in a way that isn't threatening what people believe, but rather just reminding them to be safe. And that, it seems, is really the key to all of this. It's just ensuring that we are all safe from the people who may or may not want us to get hurt. And I hope that as we move these conversations forward, that this will become such an obvious thing to everybody, that everybody will be asking that question when their kids go to a play date, or will be asking that question of people that they know have guns in their homes before they come over. Because if we made it something that was so culturally normal, then how many lives would be saved every day? I mean, if you think about that number, it must be massive.
It's massive, and I want to make sure that I emphasize too that we have a rich history of doing just this. So it sounds North Star, aspirational, but it's really not. When we were suffering huge numbers of fatalities to drunken driving in the 1950s and 60s, NHTSA and some of the public interest advocacy groups got together and said, how can we address this issue? What can we do? And they created a term, designated driver. It didn't exist. It was invented by Madison Avenue, as was secondhand smoke, as were a number of terms like that, which have had it material buckle up for seatbelts, right? And what that did is allowed people to rally around the term and then socialize what that meant, to the point where I grew up and assumed everyone understood it was culturally totally unacceptable to have a drink and drive, right?
Yeah.
My parents didn't grow up with that term. They didn't even know what it was. But today, my daughters absolutely know. That's how much you can shift a culture. And that's been credited, that campaign, with saving huge numbers of lives from what was a large contingent of people who were drinking and driving. It was socially acceptable until it wasn't. That's exactly, we studied those campaigns. We didn't come up with End Family Fire in this campaign on our own. We studied all of those other public health campaigns and learned from them. And that's also why we're taking the next step, just so you know, in our Show Gun Safety campaign, to go to Hollywood, to those who are making the TV shows we watch and the movies we watch, to say, hey, we want you to sign up to Show Gun Safety. That means, number one, ask whether a firearm is necessary to advance the narrative. If it is, show gun safety. Show that firearm safely stored. Very, very simple. And we've had some amazing conversations with studios. We've done presentations to all of the major talent agencies. And think about how much of a difference that made around changing the trajectory of smoking.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. Yeah, absolutely. Right. I remember that.
And that's exactly what we're trying to do with the proliferation of how much we see firearms, and actually showing safe storage would be a very welcome and very important message as part of the kinds of content that is being delivered every single day to households across this country.
Yeah. Well, Kris, I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed listening to you speak. And I also can't tell you how good it makes me feel to know that you are out there leading the charge on this incredible initiative. I do feel like before this interview, I was reading everything and I was like, my gosh, this woman is unbelievable. So thank you for doing this tireless work. I mean, as I said at the beginning, as a mom of 3, turning on the news in the morning feels like a little bit of a scary thing every single day. And the hope is that there is hope. And so I feel that after speaking to you today. And I hope that our listeners out there listen to this conversation and hear the words that are being said, because it is important to ask these questions so we can save lives. And I thank you for being here and doing this. And instead of asking everyone a question, which is what I typically do at the end of this conversation, what I would say to everyone is ask somebody the question about whether or not they have firearms in their homes. And Kris, thank you for being here today. Tell us where we can find you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. So folks can find me on X at KrisB_Brown and on Insta at KrisBrown68. And of course, information about Brady is on our website at bradyunited.org.
Well, we will be following along and cheering along. And thank you so much for being here. I'd like to thank Rockefeller Center and to Joe, my incredible producer at Newsstand Studios, for making sure that we always sound wonderful. I'm Lydia Fenet. This is Claim Your Confidence. Tune in again next week for another amazing interview.